So this morning I'm privileged to be back on this stage to speak to you about a very important topic that was last spoken in August 2008 at the Mexico International AIDS Conference, where in a closing plenary, Justice Edwin Cameron, who you may all know is a judge in the Constitutional Court of South Africa and the only highest-ranking African official who has come public about his HIV status, inspired us to a political call of action towards addressing the issue of deliberate infection. I stand here to speak about what has happened since then and to also have my own call to action so that we can finally put to rest the bed, this thorn that we call HIV criminalisation. I trust that you will be persuaded to join me in this journey and ensure that the next time we are speaking on the podium about this topic, we have fought the fight against bad laws in the era of HIV. I'll not have the privilege of a PowerPoint presentation, but this is how I plan to walk you through this conversation. We will have a quick one-on-one so that we're all on the same page on what HIV criminalization is. We will quickly walk through what the successes have been, and then we will see what is left for us to be able to take forward. And this will not be a high-level talk. I will end the talk with practical recommendations for everyone in this room that you can live and be able to take forward to put words into action and for us to be able to see change. So let me start talking by what do we mean when we talk about HIV criminalization. HIV criminalization is the use of unjust laws or applying unjustly a criminal law to people living with HIV based solely on their HIV status. This could be a specific criminal law targeted for HIV, or it could be a general criminal law that does not specifically mention issues of HIV. So what does the law then punish? The law punishes non-disclosure. If you're HIV positive and you fail to disclose to your partner, then in certain jurisdictions, the law does punish that. In other jurisdictions, the law punishes exposure. You do an act, you do something that puts the other person at a risk of getting infected, then you can be punished by the law. Thirdly, what does the law again punish? Transmission, where there is actual transmission and the other person gets infected. So those are the three things that the law seeks to punish. And the basis of these laws is very irrational. It is based on fear, which leads to stigma, which eventually manifests itself in terms of discrimination. There is no legal or scientific basis of having these laws on the book. And so, what positive things have happened since Justice Edwin called us into action? They say charity begins at home, and I will begin with a successful Kenyan case that challenged one of the many laws in Kenya that was criminalizing exposure and non-disclosure. This is Section 24 of the HIV and AIDS Prevention and Control Act, and three judges, Justice Isaac Lenaola, Justice George Odunga, and Judge Mombi Gugi, struck down that law on a suit that was brought by the AIDS Law Project in Kenya, where they say that the law was vague, the law was unconstitutional, it violated the right to privacy, because in that law it said if a person knew their HIV status, they had an obligation to inform their sexual contact of their HIV status, and that they had an obligation to make efforts to ensure that they do not put the other person at a risk of getting infected. So the law placed the entire obligation on the person who was living with HIV. And the law further on went to say that if the person did not want to disclose, the healthcare worker was then mandated to disclose on behalf of that person, whether they liked it or not. Gladly, the Kenyan High Court has struck down that law, one of the many successes. We've also had tremendous success, and I would urge you to have a look at this publication by UNDP on the Global Commission on Law and HIV, which rightfully tells us that We have had success in the repeal of certain criminal laws, and we must appreciate the following countries that I'm going to name that have been able to repeal the criminal laws since 2008 when Justice Edwin Cameron last spoke to us. Ghana, Greece, Honduras, Kenya, Malawi, Mongolia, Switzerland, Tajikistan, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, and at least 2 states in the US, including California and Iowa, who have been able to repeal laws that put people living with HIV at a risk. Let's congratulate those countries. So we know science has taught us a lot since HIV came in the 1980s. We now know if people take their ARVs, suppress their viral load, they are unable to put other people at a risk of getting infected. We know science has taught us that people living with HIV can live a normal life and that HIV is no longer a death threat. But more still needs to be done because the application of this law irrationally is still continuing even as we speak. Even though we know what science says, even though we know what the law says, even though we know there are decisions that say that this is not the right way to go, these laws are being applied in this day and age of time. And to demonstrate that, I will quickly run you to 3 cases in 3 different African countries for you to appreciate this perspective. Allow me to take you to my neighboring country, Uganda, and bring to you the very painful story of a 64-year-old nurse called Rosemary Nambiru, a grandmother, a mother, a member of the International AIDS Society, and a nurse who had served her life. In 2014, while drawing blood from an infant, the 67-year-old nurse had a needle stick injury, and she was falsely or wrongly accused of intentionally exposing a child to HIV while administering an injection. She was arrested on live TV, she was paraded in front of live media, and the initial charge against her was attempted murder. Take into account that the child was never infected with HIV. She was taken to a magistrate's court, the charges were changed to aggravated assault, and she was eventually imprisoned for 3 years. Her sentence was appealed thanks to colleagues in Uganda from ICW, from Uganet and Sehud, and even when their decision was appealed, she had already spent 5 months in remand serving her sentence. And even when you look at the appeal decision, the judge doesn't strike down the law, but says that the sentence was too harsh and reduces the sentence to the period she has served in the remand so that she can be released. But what I want to bring out of this story, apart from all the mishaps in the legal, is the role of the media. Rose's life has been tarnished. The headlines were "Killer Nurse Arrested," and even after she was released by the court, the next headline was "HIV Murderer Nurse Released." So the media, you have a role to shape the lives of people. You can destroy it or you can create it, and Rosemary case provides an avenue. Luckily, there's a toolkit by HIV Justice Network that the media can turn to be able to ensure they get the messaging right. I now want to move you to Malawi, a very lovely country in the heart of Southern Africa. And I want to bring to your attention a case, EL versus the state. This case speaks to a woman who is living with HIV and on antiretroviral treatment, who was charged of unlawful, negligent, and reckless conduct likely to spread a disease dangerous to life. What was her crime? During a community meeting, she accidentally breastfed another person's child. The child did not contract HIV, and the evidence on record shows that it was accidental. On a plea of guilty because she was not represented in court by anyone, she was sentenced to 9 months in prison and hard labor. Can you imagine that? But gladly, thanks to the work of a brilliant organization in Southern Africa called SALC, who have invested in training lawyers with support from the Global Fund, were able to train lawyers from 10 African countries, and one of them included my learned colleague, Wesley Mwafurila. Wesley, who picked up this story in the media, took up the appeal before the court and took it before a judge who had also been part of a training funded by the Global Fund, administered by UNDP, to argue the case, brought forth to the court evidence about what is the risk of transmission through breastfeeding, brought in evidence from experts who knew about HIV and the law, like Michaela Clayton, to explain to the court. And based on that, the court overturned the decision and set this woman free. Would you imagine a lady who has to breastfeed a child would now be languishing in jail had it not been for legal intervention from lawyers and judges who knew about the law? So this proves to the point that funders, you must invest in structural remedies. You must invest in structural barriers to HIV. The Global Fund is doing it. Nothing stops PEPA from doing it, and nothing stops the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation from funding human rights work. I began by saying charity starts at home, and I want to end with a case from Kenya. This is as recent as 4 months ago, and a case currently happening in one of our counties called Kericho. We have the case of a gentleman, E.W., whose name we cannot release for purposes of confidentiality. But he's a 30-year-old man who was arrested by police on an evening. And while he was resisting arrest, and in the struggle to have him arrested, he beat the thumb of the police officer. And when that happened, he was violently assaulted. And from what we have on record, they took him to a hospital, and he was tested for HIV without his consent, and he only came to learn about his HIV status in court when the charges were being read to him, and he was charged under Section 26 of the Sexual Offences Act, where he was charged with deliberately infecting a police officer with a deadly disease. Remember, HIV is not a death sentence. Remember, science has shown us that the risk in transmitting HIV through biting is very negligible or almost impossible. Take back the first case we had in Texas in the US, where a man was sentenced to 35 years in jail for spitting at a police officer, and juxtapose it with what is happening in Kericho. And that is why we are saying work still needs to be done. So what are my recommendations going forward? I will start with the donors because they are the purse holders of this important money. Donors, you need to fund the right work. You need to fund sensitization of communities. Communities need to know their rights. Communities need to know where do you go when your rights have been violated. You need to fund sensitization programs for lawyers, for judges, for law enforcement officers, for healthcare workers, and even parliamentarians, so that they can understand what is the implication of some of these laws and what do they have to take into account when they are deciding cases, when they are representing clients, when they are arresting clients, when they are providing healthcare services, and when they are debating in their parliaments around this particular issue. So donors, please invest in the right programs. UNAIDS has a fantastic 7-guide program that you could consider and invest. And if we can invest in the 68 countries in the world that still have laws that criminalize people who are living with HIV, we will be speaking a different story. To the judges in the room, I must say, leaving this room, and if you go back to your homes and you have a case you're going to listen to, apply science, apply the law, apply rationality, and be able to ensure that you make a decision that takes the rights-based approach into interest. And if you're a lawyer in this room and you get a case, you must think it through, you must consult, and you must put forward the right evidence and case before the court, because a judge is only good as the lawyer who appears before him. So if you bring a bad case, you will get a bad judgment. If you bring a good case, you will get a good judgment. And to the law enforcement officers in the room, yes, you have to enforce the law, but you have to be able to see Am I paying rationale to the law that is in place? You know what science says, you know the effect of that. Would you want to have a mind shift in the way you enforce some of these particular laws? To the members who represent government in the ministries of health, in the National AIDS Control Council, what you have a role to ensure that our policies are pushing more for information and rights-based information to people who are living with HIV and communities around this. I've already spoken to the media. You have a role to communicate the right message and to do it in a very responsible way. And I cannot miss the opportunity to communicate to the First Ladies, of whom we've learned do not need an appointment to the heads of states, that you would be able to raise these issues at the highest level and know that certain laws would hinder this coming into place. I have saved the best for last, and this is to the scientists who probably are the most in this room. There's going to be an expert consensus statement that will be made public tomorrow, and this statement has been developed by a number of experts and endorsed by many of them. This statement has been developed largely to break down what does science say about the risk of transmission. So to the doctors, to the epidemiologists, to the nurses, any healthcare worker in the room, my plea to you is that look out for this statement and help out back in your country by providing expert affidavit evidence for those who are taking forward cases, for those who are writing policies, for you to be able to take that forward. So as I conclude, I want to end with two quotes. One from my favorite publication, and the Bible I ask you to look at, the Global Commission on HIV and the Law. If you want to know anything about HIV and the law, this is the Bible. If you're a funder and if you want to find anything about HIV and the law, and TB and hepatitis, this is the Bible. So I will read two quotes so that I can be able to ensure the message gets home, and I will be done. So from the Global Commission report, the law alone cannot stop AIDS, nor can the law alone be blamed when HIV responses are inadequate. But the legal environment can play a powerful role in the well-being of people living with HIV and those vulnerable to HIV. Good laws, fully resourced and rigorously enforced, can widen access to prevention and healthcare services, improve the quality of treatment, enhance social support for people affected by the epidemic, protect human rights that are vital to survival, and save the public money. And to my final quote, and in honor of the award I got yesterday, as Elizabeth Taylor said from this podium in 1992, we are here to fight the virus, not to fight the people. HIV is not a crime. Thank you for listening to me.